That's one thing that we tell patients. It's important to understand that a negative result from a genetic test does not mean that you do not have a genetic condition.
I am back to share my story with genetic testing. I've had whole exome sequencing performed by a geneticist as well as through Probably Genetic, and I was impressed to discover that the results from each were identical. So if you're worried about accuracy, do not worry. It is the same thing. I have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is a genetic condition, and I also have something called compound heterozygous TTC7A deficiency. However, I have had symptoms since birth. They were primarily GI. I had my first dislocation caused by Ehlers-Danlos syndrome when I was an infant, but aside from that, I lived a pretty normal childhood. My health did not truly take a turn for the worst until I was around age 10. That is when I started having dizziness and fainting and blackout episodes. Around age 14, I was seeing an autonomic specialist. I was undiagnosed at the time, aside from dysautonomia and gastroparesis. The autonomic specialist was curious as to what the underlying cause of my dysautonomia was. He mentioned that I could potentially have mitochondrial disease as my underlying cause. He told me not to go Google it because there's a spectrum. Some patients are very mild and others are severe. What did I do? I Googled it. Scared the heck out of me. He further elaborated that a good way to rule mitochondrial disease in or out without undergoing the testing is to start taking some of the Mito cocktail. The Mito cocktail is a combination of supplements that help provide the body cells with energy. I was prescribed L-carnitine and CoQ10. The L-carnitine did absolutely nothing. It was discontinued because it didn't work. The CoQ10 helped a little bit with muscle weakness. About a year later, my local neurologist agreed with this autonomic specialist. She immediately ran the basic genetic panel for mitochondrial disease. That was negative, but she said just because that didn't show up with a mutation, it did not mean that I did not have mitochondrial disease. Once that came back negative, I was sent to a neurogeneticist, Dr. John Schaffner in Atlanta, Georgia. He's no longer seeing patients. He's now strictly research, but at the time he saw me, he agreed with both of the other doctors that I could probably have mitochondrial disease. He ran more exome sequencing, a muscle biopsy, a skin biopsy, and a spinal tap. The whole exome sequencing was negative for mitochondrial disease. My skin biopsy showed the beginnings of neuropathy, but nothing that was that big of a deal. And the muscle biopsy was inconclusive. What did show something, however, was my spinal tap. Dr. Schaffner said I had a condition called cerebral folate deficiency with autoreceptor antibodies. And what that is that folate cannot pass the blood-brain barrier. If you test my plasma or blood levels of folate, they are perfect. If you test the folate levels of my spinal fluid, they are extremely low. So low that they are depleting the neurotransmitters. So I was prescribed a medication called leucovorin, which is folate in a form that my body knows how to process. Dr. Schaffner was a bit baffled because, well, firstly, most people with cerebral folate deficiency, they manifest with symptoms like seizures, developmental delays, autism, and some deficits in motor skills. The only symptom that I had that fit with CFD were tremors. And leucovorin, I still take it to this day, it helped with the tremors. Another reason he was very perplexed is because CFD is normally caused by mitochondrial disease, but all of my tests were inconclusive and negative for mitochondrial disease. He left it up to my home doctors to figure out why in the world I had this cerebral folate deficiency when I didn't have mitochondrial disease. The adult doctor, once I transferred to adult care, who was prescribing my leucovorin, he figured that the genetic sequencing that I had done in 2013 for the mitochondrial disease was not advanced enough, and that since years had gone by, that we would surely find my mitochondrial disease mutation. As I mentioned, and as Lukas mentioned, and I will play his little clip on this too. The field of genetics is ever evolving. As science catches up, new genes are discovered. As patients progress and have more symptoms, the doctors better know what genes to go look for disease-causing mutations.
Because roughly 150 new disease-causing genes are discovered every single year, almost every time that you rerun analyses on a big enough number of patients, you will find additional results. The ballpark figure is diagnostic yield, meaning the percentage of people that got tested that actually get a result goes up by about 10% every year. So if last year it would have been 30%, this year it's going to be 33% if you just run the numbers on those same patients again. So we definitely do that. We've already done that for our existing patient cohorts, and we do this on a regular basis. And then if we find new results, we get back in touch with those people and let them know there is a new finding. And it doesn't cost anything.
Yeah, that's how they found my mutations, was the second time.
Yeah. I did my PhD research on a bunch of cases that were initially analyzed, no result was found. And then a few years later, we were able to identify a result. And the reason for that is genetics is still a very, very young field. And there's just a lot that's being discovered continuously. That's one thing that we tell patients. It's important to understand that a negative result from a genetic test does not mean that you do not have a genetic condition. It could very well mean that at the time the test was done, we simply didn't know yet what's causing it.
I was referred to a metabolic geneticist, and she did more whole exome sequencing and tested for everything. I was still negative for mitochondrial disease. So I finally relayed that to rest. My whole exome sequencing did, the first time it was ran, it did show a couple things. First, it showed a mutation in the gene FLNC. In my medical chart, they say that causes muscle weakness and myopathy, but it was more of a variant of uncertain significance. They also found a mutation in the gene KCNQ1, and that is a disease-causing for sure. I am on treatment now. It is a genetic cardiac condition, and if untreated, it can be fatal, but thankfully, praise the Lord, we found it. At that time, those were the only two mutations found, and it was nothing, although I'm grateful that we found the heart mutation, it was nothing that just gave us an overarching answer. And with the Ehlers-Danlos syndrome type 3, that was solely a clinical diagnosis. A couple years after that, I had a colectomy because I was having repeated bowel obstructions, and I kept having these weird episodes of very high 104 fevers, crashing blood counts, and my liver was progressively getting worse, even though I wasn't a long-term TPN patient at that point. I hadn't been on it for very long at all. I was eventually diagnosed with HLH, but what's interesting is that my geneticist called in the middle of that admission saying that they found something else. She said that she reanalyzed my genetic data and they found compound heterozygous mutations in the gene TTC7A. That gene is imperative to gut integrity and the immune system. And people with those mutations, they typically have homozygous mutations and they die very early on in childhood. They have repeated bowel obstructions, severe immune deficiencies, and inflammatory bowel disease. The geneticist said that I would have compound heterozygous mutations, and because of that, I am not as severe as those with homozygous mutations that die very early on in childhood. I present with milder versions of the same symptoms, but my immunodeficiency isn't as profound. Instead, with the compound heterozygous mutations, those patients tend to have more excessive autoimmunity. This explained everything. Why I had antibodies against the folate receptor. I have antibodies against quite a few various organs and systems in my body. It explained the sudden development of bleeding in my bowel and ulcerations. It also explained the immune condition HLH that I had had and the bowel obstructions. I share all this because mitochondrial disease was not my answer, but it could be yours. And the whole process of ruling mitochondrial disease in or out, allowed them to find out what was truly wrong. And although there's absolutely nothing that can be done about it, there's one medication that was tested on zebrafish for my condition, and I do not qualify because it is so harsh on the liver and my liver disease is so progressed. But they did trial some random medication that is supposed to help the liver do its job, essentially, and that seems to be working enough that we can delay the transplant, because the only other treatments for the TTC7A are small bowel and liver transplant or bone marrow transplant. So the sponsored program with Probably Genetic is 100% worth it. I will post the link to the survey and for more details down below. I will also put Lucas's contact information down below, and I am also here for any questions or to help however way I can. I want to thank Lucas for what his company is doing and for this interview to give you all more information, and I want to thank everyone for watching, and I hope this helps you.